It is such a beautiful morning. With the long hot summer that we've had, I can tell you I am embracing these crisp fall mornings. We are about a month before our average first frost date, and when that starts to happen, there are certain tasks that I want to be sure and complete before that first frost comes. I've got a little wiggle room here and there. It doesn't have to be exact, but I'm just going to show you some of the things that I'm doing in my garden to prepare for the first frost, why I'm doing them now, so that maybe you can get an idea of some things that you can be doing as you head up to your first frost of the season. The first thing I'm going to be doing is pruning my tomatoes, cutting off the tops here. If you notice, these tomatoes are still flowering. I'm actually amazed they've lasted this long, but I think they just kind of took a hiatus in the heat, and because we didn't have a lot of rain, I actually didn't have a lot of disease problems. And so I left them in here to hopefully get a late harvest. I think I'm gonna get that. But about a month before my first frost, I know is not gonna be enough time for these flowers to actually set fruit. So what I wanna do here is to cut the top of these plants off, because I know that these flowers are not going to form fruit in time. What this will do is it will help the plant to be able to devote the rest of its energy to ripening up the tomatoes that are already on the vine. So hopefully I can get those ripened up before the first frost sets in. I'm going to prune off right above where the fruit is, the last fruit that I can see. That way, hopefully that fruit can have enough time to develop. Same thing here. We've got some fruit there, so I'm going to prune above that. It's also worth mentioning that the time that you start topping off your tomatoes will depend too on the type of tomato that you're growing. Obviously, we have cherry tomatoes that are really small, and we have some beefsteak that are a lot larger. And so they're going to take anywhere between, I've read 25 to 65 days to go from flower to fruit. Could be even longer depending on the weather conditions. They don't like to fruit in the heat, but they also are probably going to slow down in the fall as well. So I'm kind of going toward that middle line because these are San Marzanos. They're not super big like a slicing tomato. So that's why I'm doing it about a month before my average first frost date. This next task is one I actually did a couple of days ago with my nephew, and that has to do with composting. I am a lazy composter, which I showed a video on how I do that in the past, so you can go check that out. But basically what that means is that throughout the season, I just layer on everything in my compost pile into two particular bins. I really don't mess with turning it, and I don't water it. All the things you're supposed to do, I just don't do. I just kind of pile it all together. Well, that will work. It'll just take longer. The drawback is that you're not left at the end of the season with a lot of finished compost. You're left with some finished compost, usually that's at the bottom of the pile, and then you've got some larger debris, especially if you don't chop it up, which a lot of times I don't. I just put it out here as I can. That's what I have time to do. So in the fall, what I'll do is I'll take the debris that hasn't broken down yet, that wasn't in really small pieces, and I'll take it out and I'll put it in a compost pile for the winter. And then below that will be some really rich finished compost that I want to put on my garden in the fall. This is what I did last year, and I planted my onions the next spring and my okra, and that particular ground did really well. And so I wanted to replicate that this year. So I took pretty much 2 compost bins full of things that I added to my compost pile since the spring, and then I took all of the big particles, put it in one compost bin, and took all of the fairly finished compost and put it directly in my garden. That way, the ones that stay in the one compost bin, they will be able to have a chance to continue breaking down over the winter, and then the finished compost from what I've had over the season gets a chance to go directly into my garden, and that way it'll be ready to plant into in the spring. This is the new compost pile I've developed from this empty bin, and then everything else is here in this bin. That will continue to break down over the winter, and hopefully, especially toward the bottom of it, I'll have some of that to use in the spring if I want to. And then over here, I have my bin for fallen leaves. I don't know if you can tell that very easily, but I'll be adding the fallen leaves to that bin as we go as well. Another thing I want to do anytime before that first frost, and maybe even a little bit before that, is trim and harvest my basil, mainly harvest it. This is what I did last night, actually. This is what was left. We were eating basil pesto last night, and so I needed to harvest as much as I could. I create basil pesto to last our family all season, and so I want to make sure and harvest it before the frost and before the temperatures get into the 40s. Sometimes basil is actually affected by 40-degree temperature as well. With these particular plants, I kept them trimmed. I did not let them go to seed. I did not let them flower because the purpose for them, for me, was basil leaf production. I have other basil that I let go to flower, I let go to seed. They're great for pollinators, but these two have been for our kitchen. So I've kept them trimmed all season long, but what I want to do is big final harvest before the cold sets in. That way I have enough basil for basil pesto, but I also dry it in the dehydrator and grind it up for basil in my spice cabinet. But that's a big thing that you want to do, especially leading up to your first frost. Now, I chose to do it about a month before my average first frost because basil's pretty resilient and it will continue growing. So I'll actually probably be able to get another cutting off of here, and at the very least we'll be able to have fresh basil for a little bit longer. Some people actually take basil cuttings and then they move them indoors to be able to have fresh basil in the wintertime. I've never done that before, but it's a great idea, and this is about the time that you'll want to do that as well. Another thing I want to do before that average first frost date is to prepare the bed that I'm going to be planting garlic in. And this is the bed that the garlic is going to go in this year. I have some bush beans that are finishing up, and then I have squash and zucchini over here. Neither of those plants are frost tolerant, so that's a really great way to plan out where you're going to be planting your garlic, is choose an area where you have crops that are not going to survive a frost, because garlic is planted right around your average first frost date. Now, ideally, I'm going to take these out in the next couple of weeks. It's going to be hard if the squash and zucchini are still producing. I may just have to hang on to them for a little while, but these bush beans are pretty much done. So I'm going to take these out, and then I'm going to add a layer of compost to this area ahead of planting my garlic. I found that adding compost to any bed really makes a big difference, but especially with garlic. That way, when the average first frost date comes around, for me, that's usually the end of October, early November, these beds will be ideally ready to plant. I personally like to plant my garlic ahead of a rainfall. That way the rainfall can get them all settled in and established, and I don't have to do any supplemental irrigation. And so a lot of times that decision is made on the fly. So before that first frost date, I would love to have this whole bed completely prepared. That way I can make a decision to plant my garlic right ahead of a rain and we're ready to go. Another thing I want to do ahead of my first fall frost is I want to harvest any beans that I'm specifically saving for seed. Now, if you're growing beans for dry bean eating, this will apply as well. But what I want to do is I want to catch these beans while I can still get them and I can get the seed before the pod opens up and drops to the ground, and eventually that's how you get volunteers. But I want to catch them then, and I want to do this anytime before that first frost. In general, frost is going to kill bean plants, so I want to get them before that. A month ahead is a little bit early, but it's still something to keep in mind. Anytime before that first frost is a great time to harvest those beans for seed saving. So let me show you how to do it. So what we're looking for here is we want these very dry bean pods. And I'm gonna take them off here. You can see that they're still intact, and so what we want to do is catch them before they drop. And I can open these, I can open these up here. These in particular are black beans. And you can see that I can harvest the seeds. Hopefully you can see that. I know it's lots of shadows this morning, but we can harvest the seeds here for any kind of bean, really. And this is very much the time to do it. If they're hard like that, if their outer pod is hard like that, they are ready to harvest, to be able to save for seed, or if you are harvesting them for dry beans, you can do the same. Another thing that I'm going to do a couple of weeks up to a month before my average first frost date is plant spinach. And this is an area cleared out right here that I have planned to plant it. The thing about spinach is it is very soil temperature sensitive. So if you plant it in the fall, like the early part of the fall when the soil temperature is too high, it just doesn't sprout at a good rate. I've learned that the hard way. And so what I've started doing in my climate, which is zone 7B, although I know people can do this in cooler climates as well, is I sow my spinach right around a month or so before my average first frost date. And it does germinate, and then it kind of stalls out when the daylight gets below 10 hours. Really hardly anything will grow at that point anyway, but then it will survive my winter, and then come January, February, when the day length starts to lengthen, the spinach will start growing again. And it's actually one of the first crops that I harvest in the early spring. But this is the perfect time to plant it directly from seed into the garden, because the nighttime temperatures are generally in the 50s and the 60s. And so with that, you're going to get a little bit lowering of a soil temperature. If you plant it too early in the fall, the soil temperature is just too hot for them to sprout. So that's why this is a perfect time for many climates to be able to plant spinach, is about a month to a couple of weeks before your average first frost date. So I know you can't tell it, but beneath this obelisk trellis, I actually have peas growing. They have sprouted and they're growing well, but the problem is that as we get closer to the winter solstice and we just passed the fall equinox, day length is getting much shorter, which means even the cool season crops that typically can manage a little bit of shade tend to struggle if they don't get a lot of sunlight. So what I'm going to do at this point, you can see a lot of these crops are overgrown. I've got basil here that I can already see the pollinators, so I really don't want to cut too much, but I do want to strategically prune out some of the places that are casting shade, because the sun is such an important thing when it comes to these cool season crops. So that's what I'm going to try to do, is get as much sun as I can to these peas. The same would be true for beets and carrots, anything that you've got in your garden. Whenever the weather starts to cool off and you're really not worried too much about heat, shade is definitely something you want to eliminate so they can get as much sunlight as possible. Just with those couple of cuts, I already have some sunlight here on these peas, so hopefully they will start growing even faster with more sunlight on them. Another thing I like to do about a month before my average first frost date is do some trimming on my perennial herbs. Now, what we don't want to do is trim them all back right before the freezes set in, because that could leave them vulnerable in the wintertime. But if we do this a few weeks to a month before our average first frost date, it gives them time to recover. Now, I never want to trim more than a third of the plant in general, just to make sure it doesn't get shocked. So I want to take out, I'm definitely going to take out some of these leaves here that are yellowing and look like they may have a little bit of a problem, whether it's nutrition or disease or something. But I want to take those out. That way I can leave room for some of this better growth here. Some of this more green, vibrant growth, I want to leave room for that. Now, another thing I can do besides just taking out these ones that are kind of old and look bad is it's actually a great time to harvest a lot of these. I typically do my final harvest of many of my perennial herbs like oregano, lemon balm, peppermint right around this time, because it makes them completely fresh, as much as you can get fresh in a dried herb before winter. So I'll put them in my dehydrator and I'll dry them. And obviously when you're doing this in, September, October, then they're gonna be fresher as you start drinking your hot teas in the winter time. So this is a great time to start harvesting some of these perennial herbs at the same time. If you found this listing of garden tasks helpful, make sure to check out the free download that I created called Seasonal Task List for any zone. You'll find the link in the description, and it will help you decide what you need to be doing from season to season. And for more garden content like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and check out my podcast if you're a podcast listener at the Beginner's Garden Podcast. I'll see you on the next video.